The fog rolled in thick that morning, November 1896, wrapping itself around the western edge of San Francisco like a shroud soaked in salt water. If you stood at the cliff's edge where the land surrendered to the Pacific, you could hear it, the low, rhythmic thunder of waves against rock, the kind of sound that makes you feel small, that reminds you the ocean has been here longer than any fortune, any name, any empire. And on that morning, if you looked down through the mist, you would have seen something impossible taking shape, something that defied every law of physics, every constraint of budget, every whisper of common sense. You would have seen the largest indoor swimming facility the world had ever known rising from the rocks like a palace made of glass and iron, and the kind of ambition that only comes from men who believe they can own the ocean itself. His name was Adolph Sutro, and what he built wasn't just a bathhouse. It was a cathedral to excess, a monument to the belief that wealth, properly applied, could create paradise on earth. 7 swimming pools, each one a different temperature, over 500 private dressing rooms, a museum filled with Egyptian mummies and taxidermied animals, a promenade lined with tropical plants that had no business surviving in the California fog, a retractable glass roof that could be opened when the sun finally burned through the gray, and a seating capacity of 10,000 people, more than most theaters, more than most churches, more than most places where human beings gathered to witness something they couldn't experience anywhere else. The Sutro Baths opened to the public on March 14th, 1896, and on that first day, over 25,000 people tried to get inside. They came from every neighborhood in San Francisco. They came from across the bay. They traveled for hours just to see what one man's fortune could build at the edge of the world. They paid 25 cents for adults, 10 cents for children. Modest prices, designed not to exclude but to include, because Adolph Sutro had a vision that was, at least on the surface, democratic. He wanted the working class to swim in the same pools as the wealthy. He wanted the immigrant families from North Beach to splash in the same water as the railroad barons from Nob Hill. He wanted to build something that felt like it belonged to everyone, even though it belonged entirely to him. If you're still reading, you already know something is wrong with this story. You can sense the rot beneath the beauty, the cost hidden inside the dream. These stories of men who build palaces at the edge of the ocean, who promise paradise and deliver something darker, these stories take time to research, to verify, to tell properly, if that kind of depth matters to you. If you value the work that goes into uncovering what most documentaries skip over, then you're in the right place. And perhaps you'll stay. But first, we need to understand the man who built it. Because Adolph Sutro wasn't born into wealth. He clawed his way up from nothing, which makes what he eventually became all the more tragic. Adolf Heinrich Joseph Sutro was born on April 29, 1830, in Aachen, Prussia, in a region that would later become Germany. His father, Emanuel Sutro, was a cloth merchant and factory owner, moderately successful but hardly wealthy by the standards of the Prussian merchant class. The family was Jewish, which meant they lived under constant low-grade pressure, legal restrictions on where they could live and what professions they could enter, social exclusion from the Gentile community, the kind of prejudice that doesn't announce itself with violence but grinds you down with 1,000 small humiliations. When Adolf was 11 years old, his father died suddenly. The family business collapsed almost immediately. Creditors circled. The comfortable middle-class life the Sutro family had known evaporated in a matter of months. His mother, Rosa Sutro, was left with 11 children and almost no money. She was 42 years old, widowed in a society that offered widows few opportunities and even less respect. But Rosa was not a woman who accepted defeat. She looked at the situation, the debts, the discrimination, the limited future her children faced in Prussia, and she made a decision that would alter the trajectory of her son's life. She would take her children to America, the place where, according to the letters and newspapers that circulated through Jewish communities across Europe, a man could make something of himself regardless of his birth. They arrived in Baltimore in November 1850, just as the California gold rush was remaking the entire concept of what wealth could mean in America. The timing was not coincidental. Rosa had read the reports. She knew that fortunes were being made in California, that the old rules didn't apply there, that a clever young man with ambition could rise faster in San Francisco than he ever could in Baltimore. Adolph worked in his uncle's tobacco shop on Lombard Street. He learned English with the fierce determination of someone who understood that language was power. He saved every dollar, denying himself even small pleasures. And in November 1851, at the age of 21, he boarded a ship bound for San Francisco with $200 in his pocket, his entire savings. And the kind of hunger that can only come from watching your family lose everything once and vowing never to let it happen again. San Francisco in 1851 was chaos incarnate. The population had exploded from less than 1,000 people in 1848 to over 25,000 by the time Sutro arrived. Tents covered the hills like lesions on the landscape. Hastily constructed wooden buildings lined streets that turned to mud whenever it rained. Saloons and brothels operated openly, sometimes in the same building. Murders were common enough that newspapers stopped reporting most of them. Fires were constant. 6 major fires swept through the city between 1849 and 1851, destroying thousands of structures and killing dozens of people. Fortunes were made overnight and lost by morning. Gambling dens operated 24 hours a day, and everyone, absolutely everyone, was obsessed with gold. But Adolph Sutro understood something that most prospectors didn't. The real money wasn't in digging for gold. It was in selling to the men who did the digging. He opened a tobacco shop on Montgomery Street. It failed within 6 months. He tried importing goods from the East Coast. That failed too, bankrupted by shipping costs and competition from larger merchants. But he kept watching, kept learning, kept looking for the angle that everyone else was missing. He worked as a clerk. He studied assaying and metallurgy. He taught himself engineering from books, and slowly, methodically, he began to understand how mining actually worked, not just the romantic image of a lone prospector panning for nuggets, but the industrial reality of extracting precious metals from the earth at scale. And then he found his opening. By the mid-1860s, the center of gravity in Western mining had shifted from California to Nevada, to a place called the Comstock Lode, the richest silver deposit ever discovered in the United States. The Comstock Lode was discovered in 1859 near Virginia City, Nevada, and within a few years it was producing staggering quantities of silver and gold. At its peak, the Comstock Lode would produce over 400 million in silver and gold between 1859 and 1880, which adjusted for inflation equals approximately 8 billion today. The wealth generated by the Comstock built San Francisco. It financed railroads, banks, newspapers, and mansions. It created the Silver Kings, men like William Ralston, William Sharon, John Mackay, and James Fair, who became some of the richest and most powerful men in America. But the mines themselves were nightmares. They were deep, some extending over 3,000 feet below the surface of Mount Davidson. They were hot. Temperatures inside the deepest shafts reached 130 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes higher, hot enough that miners could only work for 15-minute intervals before they had to be pulled up to cool down. They were deadly. Cave-ins and flooding killed miners weekly, and they were hugely inefficient because there was no effective way to ventilate the tunnels or drain the underground water that constantly seeped in from subterranean springs and threatened to flood the entire operation. Sutro saw the problem clearly. The mines needed ventilation. They needed drainage. They needed a way to get men and materials in and out quickly, and he saw the solution: a tunnel. Not a vertical shaft descending from the surface, but a horizontal tunnel, a massive adit that would run 4 miles from the base of the mountain directly into the heart of the Comstock Lode at a depth of approximately 1,600 feet below the surface. The tunnel would provide ventilation, dramatically reducing the heat and making conditions safer. It would drain the water that constantly threatened to flood the mines. It would provide an escape route in case of cave-ins or fires. And most importantly for Sutro, he would charge the mining companies a royalty for every ton of ore they extracted using his tunnel. He calculated the toll at $2 per ton, a fee the companies could easily afford given the value of the ore, but which would generate enormous revenue for whoever controlled the tunnel. It was a brilliant plan, audacious, expensive, and everyone told him it was impossible. Sutro spent 3 years trying to raise the capital. He traveled to Virginia City and gave speeches to the miners themselves, promising them that his tunnel would save their lives, would make the mines safer, would allow them to work deeper and extract more silver. The miners believed him, they loved him, but the big mining companies, controlled by the Silver Kings, opposed him at every turn. They didn't want to pay royalties. They didn't want an outsider, especially a Jewish outsider, controlling infrastructure they depended on. So they used their political power to block him, to sabotage his financing efforts, to spread rumors that the tunnel would never work, that it would cost too much, that Sutro was a charlatan looking to steal their money. But Sutro was relentless. He lobbied the Nevada legislature, which passed a bill granting him the right to build the tunnel. He went to Congress in Washington and lobbied for federal support, eventually securing a commitment for government bonds. He appealed directly to the miners, convincing them to invest their own wages in the tunnel company. He sold shares to small investors across California. And when American banks refused to finance him, partially because of anti-Semitism, partially because the Silver Kings controlled most of California's banking infrastructure, he traveled to Europe and raised money from French and English investors who saw the Comstock Lode as the investment opportunity of the century. In October 1869, construction finally began. The Sutro Tunnel took 13 years to complete. 13 years of blasting through solid rock with black powder and, later, dynamite. 13 years of hand-drilling holes for explosives, of hauling out debris in wheelbarrows and mule carts, of shoring up tunnel walls with timber cut from forests 50 miles away. Thousands of men worked on the project. Irish immigrants, Chinese laborers, Cornish miners, Mexican workers. Men drawn by the promise of steady wages in an industry where steady work was rare. They worked in shifts around the clock. They worked in darkness, illuminated only by candles and oil lamps. They worked in tunnels that were often filled with smoke from blasting, that dripped with groundwater, that collapsed without warning, burying men alive. The official death toll for the construction of the Sutro Tunnel is listed as 37 men, but that number is almost certainly an undercount. It only includes the deaths that were reported, the deaths that happened inside the tunnel itself, where witnesses could confirm them. It doesn't include the men who died later from silicosis, a lung disease caused by inhaling fine rock dust, a disease that was so common among tunnel workers that it was simply considered part of the job. It doesn't include the men who were injured so severely they could no longer work and died in poverty shortly after, alone in boarding houses or charity hospitals. And it doesn't include the Chinese laborers whose deaths were rarely recorded in official documents because they were considered less important, less worthy of remembrance, less fully human than their white counterparts. Adolph Sutro was hailed as a hero for building the tunnel. Newspapers called him a visionary. The miners called him their savior. But the men who actually built it, who risked their lives every day for wages of $3 to $4 per shift, who breathed rock dust and handled unstable explosives and worked in conditions that would be illegal by any modern standard, those men were forgotten almost immediately. There's no monument to them, no plaque listing their names. History remembers Sutro. It doesn't remember them. The tunnel was finally completed on July 8, 1878. It measured 20,489 feet long, nearly 4 miles, making it one of the longest tunnels in the world at that time. It cost over $5 million to build, equivalent to roughly $130 million today. And when the final blast connected the tunnel to the Comstock mines, water poured out at a rate of over 4 million gallons per day. Air flowed in, the mines cooled, conditions improved, Everything Sutro had promised came true, and Adolph Sutro became rich. But here's the twist that makes this story so perfectly tragic. By the time the tunnel was completed, the richest veins of the Comstock Lode were already exhausted. The Silver Kings had extracted most of the easily accessible ore. Production was declining, silver prices were falling due to increased global supply, and the mining boom that had defined Nevada for 2 decades was ending. The Sutro Tunnel worked exactly as promised, but it opened just as the party was winding down. Sutro, who had spent 13 years obsessing over this project, who had sacrificed everything to see it completed, realized immediately that he needed to get out. So he sold. He sold his shares in the tunnel company. He sold his stakes in various mining operations. He liquidated everything connected to Nevada and took his fortune, estimated at over $10 million, roughly $280 million in today's dollars, and he moved back to San Francisco. And there, at the age of 50, tired but wealthy, he began the second act of his life, the act that would define his legacy, the act that would lead directly to the Sutro Baths. In the 1880s, San Francisco was transforming from a rough frontier town into a genuine city. The gold rush was over. The Transcontinental Railroad was complete, connecting California to the rest of the nation. The population had grown to over 230,000. Banks had replaced saloons as the dominant institutions. Grand hotels and theaters were being built. Streets were being paved. Streetcar lines were expanding. The city was becoming something more permanent, more civilized, more expensive, and real estate was the new gold. Adolph Sutro, with his mining fortune burning a hole in his pocket, started buying land. Lots of land. He purchased over 10% of San Francisco's total area, thousands of acres stretching from downtown all the way to the western cliffs overlooking the Pacific Ocean. He bought the Cliff House, a popular resort restaurant perched dramatically on the rocks above the ocean. He bought Mount Parnassus, which would later become the site of the University of California's medical school. He bought vast tracts in what is now the Sunset and Richmond districts, land that most people considered worthless because it was too far from the city center, too windy, too foggy, too cold, covered in sand dunes that shifted with every storm. But Sutro had a vision. He saw that San Francisco would grow westward. He saw that the land everyone dismissed would eventually become prime real estate. He built his own railroad line, the Sutro Railroad, to make his western properties accessible. He created elaborate gardens at Sutro Heights, his clifftop estate overlooking the ocean, filling them with exotic plants and classical statuary. He opened the gardens to the public for free, wanting ordinary San Franciscans to experience the beauty he had created, and he began planning something that would make him not just wealthy, not just influential, but immortal. He would build something so grand, so unprecedented, so spectacular that it would permanently attach his name to the city he loved. Before we continue, consider this. What drives a man who already has more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes to keep building, to keep expanding, to keep reaching for something bigger? Is it legacy? Is it ego? Is it the fear of being forgotten, the terror of dying and leaving nothing behind but a bank account that his heirs will spend? Or is it something darker, a fundamental inability to ever feel satisfied, to ever feel that what he's accomplished is enough? That question haunts every story in this series. And if it haunts you too, if you find yourself thinking about it after this video ends, then maybe you'll understand why these stories matter. Sutro began construction on the Sutro Baths in 1894. The location was perfect. Sutro Heights, perched on the cliffs at the northwest corner of San Francisco, overlooking the Pacific Ocean and the Seal Rocks below, a cluster of jagged black volcanic formations where hundreds of sea lions barked and fought for space, creating a constant soundtrack of animal noise that could be heard for miles. It was beautiful, dramatic, isolated, and completely impractical. Building an indoor swimming complex on the edge of a cliff in one of the foggiest, coldest, most wind-battered locations in California was lunacy by any rational standard. The site had no natural protection from the elements. The wind came directly off the Pacific, unobstructed, howling across the rocks at speeds that could knock a person down. The fog was so thick on most mornings that you couldn't see 20 feet in front of you. The temperature rarely climbed above 60 degrees Fahrenheit, even in summer, and the location was over 5 miles from downtown San Francisco, accessible only by a long streetcar ride on Sutro's own railway. But Sutro wasn't interested in practicality. He was interested in spectacle. He hired Frederick Hermann Meyer, a German-born engineer, to design the structure. He imported materials from around the world, iron framework from Pennsylvania, glass from Belgium, tropical plants from Hawaii and the Philippines. He designed a system that would pump fresh seawater directly from the ocean into the pools using the natural force of high tide, and then heat-selected pools using a massive coal-fired boiler system that would consume tons of coal every single day, 8 million gallons of seawater. When the tide was low, a 750 horsepower steam engine would pump the water up from the ocean at a rate of 6,000 gallons per minute. The main building was colossal. It measured 499 feet long by 254 feet wide, covering nearly 3 acres under a single roof. The roof itself was made of over 100,000 square feet of glass, supported by an intricate iron framework that soared 60 feet above the pool deck. The glass was divided into thousands of individual panes, each one carefully fitted and sealed to keep out the wind and fog while allowing natural light to flood the interior. On clear days, rare as they were, the sunlight would stream through the glass and reflect off the water, creating a cathedral-like effect that made visitors feel like they were inside a jewel box. The pools themselves were arranged in a horseshoe shape around a central promenade. There were 7 pools in total, each one a different size, each one a different temperature, each one designed for a specific purpose. The largest pool was L-shaped, measuring 276 feet long and ranging from 3 to 10 feet deep, large enough for serious swimming and diving competitions. There was a pool for children, shallow and gently heated. There was a pool kept at 80 degrees for those who couldn't tolerate cold water. There was a frigid pool filled with seawater straight from the ocean, never heated, for hardy souls who believed cold water swimming had health benefits. And there were pools of intermediate temperatures for casual recreation, but the pools were only the beginning. Sutro filled the building with attractions designed to dazzle, to educate, to overwhelm the senses. There were 7 water slides, twisting, turning, terrifyingly steep, that launched swimmers into the pools from platforms 20 feet above the water. These weren't gentle modern water slides. They were made of polished wood, slick with water, angled at slopes that would be considered dangerously steep by today's standards. Riders would shoot down the slides at speeds high enough to send them skidding across the surface of the pool for 30 feet before they finally slowed down and sank. There were 30 swinging rings suspended from the ceiling on long chains, allowing athletic young men to show off their strength by swinging from one end of the pool to the other, hand over hand, like circus performers. There were 3 springboards, trampolines, essentially, though the technology was so new that most visitors had never seen one before. There were high diving platforms at various heights, culminating in a platform 30 feet above the deepest pool. And there were viewing galleries and promenades where spectators could watch the swimmers below, socializing and promenading in their formal clothes while working-class families splashed in the water beneath them. And then there was the museum. Adolph Sutro was an obsessive collector, and he filled every available inch of wall space, every corridor, every alcove, and every gallery with his treasures. Egyptian mummies in glass cases, their linen wrappings yellowed with age, their painted sarcophagi staring blankly at passing visitors. Stuffed lions and tigers frozen mid-roar, their glass eyes glinting in the light. A collection of medieval armor arranged as if knights were still inside, standing eternal guard. Rare books and illuminated manuscripts, some dating back centuries. Paintings from Europe, not masterpieces, but respectable works that Sutro had purchased at auction. Native American artifacts, pottery, baskets, ceremonial objects displayed with almost no context or explanation, fossils and minerals arranged in cabinet after cabinet, coins from ancient Rome, Greece, and Persia, samurai armor from Japan, a shrunken head from South America, even a mechanical orchestra that played automatically when you inserted a coin. It was a Victorian cabinet of curiosities on steroids, overwhelming in its variety, maddening in its lack of organization, equal parts educational and chaotic. Critics called it clutter, a jumbled mess that betrayed Sutro's lack of refined taste. Sutro called it education. He believed that ordinary people deserved access to culture, to history, to objects from around the world that they would never otherwise see. He believed that the museum would uplift the working classes, would inspire children, would make his bathhouse more than just a place to swim. It would be a place to learn, to grow, to be transformed. The cost of construction was staggering. Initial estimates put it at $100,000, already an enormous sum for a private recreational facility. But as construction progressed, the costs spiraled. The engineering challenges were more complex than anticipated. The glass roof needed constant replacement as panes shattered in the wind. The boiler system had to be redesigned twice. The pools needed multiple layers of waterproofing to prevent seepage into the foundation. By the time the Sutro Baths opened in March 1896, Sutro had spent well over $1 million, equivalent to roughly $35 million today. It was, by any measure, one of the most expensive private recreational facilities ever built in the United States, and Adolph Sutro, now 65 years old, stood at the edge of his glass palace on opening day and believed with absolute certainty that he had created something that would last forever. The opening was a sensation. Newspapers from San Francisco to New York ran breathless descriptions. Harper's Weekly sent an illustrator who created detailed engravings showing the pools, the crowds, the glass roof soaring overhead. Newspapers in London and Paris ran stories about the eccentric millionaire who had built a swimming palace at the edge of the American frontier. For the first few years, the Sutro Baths were wildly popular. On weekends, the pools were packed with bodies, children shrieking as they slid down the slides, young men showing off on the diving platforms, families splashing in the shallow pools, elderly couples walking the promenades arm in arm. Couples came to stroll through the museum, pausing to marvel at the mummies and the medieval armor. Tourists came from across California just to gawk at the sheer scale of it all, and Adolph Sutro, now serving as the mayor of San Francisco after a populist campaign that positioned him as the champion of the working man against the corrupt political machines of the day, walked through his creation with the satisfaction of a man who had bent the world to his will. But underneath the spectacle, underneath the crowds and the newspaper praise, the numbers were already starting to tell a different story. A story about operating costs and revenue streams, about asset depreciation and unsustainable business models. A story that Sutro, blinded by his own vision, either couldn't see or refused to acknowledge. If you've made it this far, you're not here for surface-level storytelling. You're here because something about this pulls at you, because you understand that history isn't just dates and facts, but the slow unraveling of dreams that once seemed invincible. If that's true, if you feel that pull, then you already know why this channel exists. And perhaps you'll stay for what comes next. Operating a facility the size of the Sutro Baths was breathtakingly expensive. Start with the coal. The boiler system required approximately 5 tons of coal per day to keep the pools heated. Not all the pools, just the ones that were heated. That's over 1,800 tons of coal per year. At the going rate of $7 per ton, that's $12,600 annually just for coal, equivalent to over $420,000 today. Then there was the maintenance crew. The facility required dozens of employees just to keep it running. Lifeguards, janitors, ticket sellers, boiler operators, plumbers, electricians, security guards, and supervisors. Each one needed a salary. A skilled worker in the 1890s earned about $600 per year. A facility this size likely employed at least 50 people, putting annual labor costs around $30,000 over $1 million today. Then there were the repairs. The seawater was corrosive. Salt water eats metal. It corrodes iron pipes, destroys brass fittings, pits steel, and degrades any mechanical system it touches. The pump system needed constant maintenance. Valves seized. Pipes burst. The glass roof, while beautiful, was fragile. Wind blew panes out. Temperature changes caused them to crack. Seagulls occasionally flew into the glass and shattered it. Replacing broken panes was expensive and time-consuming, and because the building was right on the ocean, exposed to constant salt spray and wind, the wood rotted faster than it should have. The pool decks needed constant refinishing. The diving platforms needed constant inspection and repair. 5 million today. Now consider revenue. Admission was 25 cents for adults, 10 cents for children. Rental of a bathing suit and towel cost an additional 25 cents. Rental of a private dressing room cost 10 cents. If we assume that on a good weekend day, the Sutro Baths attracted 2,000 visitors and that half were adults and half were children, that's gross admission revenue of about $350 per day. If the facility operated 7 days a week for 12 months, that's annual gross revenue of about $128,000. But the Sutro Baths weren't busy every day. Winter was slow, rainy days were slow, weekdays were slow. A more realistic estimate might be $100,000 to $120,000 in annual revenue. Do the math. Revenue of $100,000 to $120,000. Operating costs of $150,000 to $200,000. $3 million today. In the first year, the Sutro Baths brought in approximately $150,000 in revenue, a strong showing. But the operating costs were closer to $200,000, $7 million in today's dollars. Sutro didn't care. He was still rich. His real estate holdings were appreciating. He covered the losses out of his own pocket and told himself it was an investment in the future, in the city's culture, in his legacy. He told himself that as the city grew westward, as his neighborhoods developed, as San Francisco's population expanded, the Sutro Baths would eventually become profitable. He told himself the story that all men tell themselves when their vanity projects start bleeding money, that success is just around the corner, that persistence will pay off, that the world will eventually recognize the brilliance of what they've created. But here's what he didn't anticipate. The city didn't grow westward as quickly as he had hoped. The Sunset and Richmond districts remained sparsely populated for decades. The weather was too cold, too foggy, too unpleasant for most people. San Franciscans preferred the sunnier neighborhoods, the Mission, the Castro, Noe Valley, where the fog burned off by mid-morning and you could actually feel warm. The neighborhoods around the Sutro Baths remained largely undeveloped, which meant there was no local population to sustain the facility. Getting to the baths from downtown required a long streetcar ride on the Sutro Railroad. The trip took over an hour each way, sometimes longer if the streetcars were crowded or delayed. And while Sutro owned the railway and kept the fares low, 5 cents each way, the journey was still inconvenient. For working-class families, especially those with young children, spending half a day traveling to and from the baths, plus the cost of admission and food, plus the hassle of packing bathing suits and towels, was a luxury they couldn't afford regularly. They might visit once or twice a year as a special treat, but the Sutro Baths needed people to visit weekly to be sustainable. And then there was the weather. San Francisco's western edge is cold. The ocean temperature hovers around 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. The air temperature at the coast rarely climbs above 65 degrees, even in August. The wind is relentless, blowing directly off the Pacific at 15 to 25 miles per hour most days. The fog is oppressive, rolling in thick and wet, clinging to your skin, soaking your clothes. Swimming outdoors would have been miserable, which is why Sutro built the facility indoors. But even inside, with the glass roof and the heated pools, the building was never truly warm. The glass did nothing to stop the wind noise. The vast interior spaces were difficult to heat. Visitors shivered in their wet bathing suits as they walked from the pools to the dressing rooms. Children's lips turned blue. Parents cut their visits short because their kids were too cold to enjoy themselves. And slowly, steadily, the crowds began to thin. By 1900, attendance was declining. By 1905, the decline was undeniable. Sutro had died in 1898, and control of the facility had passed to his estate. His daughter, Emma Sutro Merritt, and the estate executors looked at the books and saw what Adolph had refused to see. The Sutro Baths were a financial disaster. They were losing tens of thousands of dollars every year, and there was no clear path to profitability. Adolph Sutro died on August 8, 1898, just 2 years after the Sutro Baths opened. He was 68 years old. The official cause of death was complications from diabetes, but those close to him knew he had been declining for months. His term as mayor had been frustrating. He'd campaigned as a reformer, but found himself unable to overcome the entrenched political machines he'd promised to destroy. His battles with the Southern Pacific Railroad, which controlled much of California's transportation infrastructure and political apparatus, had left him exhausted and bitter. And the financial struggles of the Sutro Baths, while he never admitted it publicly, weighed on him. He had believed it would be his crowning achievement, his gift to the city. Instead, it was becoming an expensive burden. He left behind a fortune estimated at $5 million, so still substantial, but a fraction of what he had possessed at his peak. Much of it was tied up in real estate that wouldn't appreciate significantly for another 2 decades, and he left behind a question that no one in his family wanted to answer. What happens to a monument when the man who built it is gone? Control of the Sutro Baths passed officially to Adolph Sutro's estate, managed by executors and eventually by his heirs. None of them had his vision. None of them had his willingness to lose money for the sake of legacy. None of them had the deep emotional attachment to the facility that had driven Sutro to keep pouring money into it, even as the losses mounted. They were business people, and they looked at the Sutro Baths the way business people look at any asset, as something that needed to generate profit or be liquidated. The first major changes came quickly. The admission price was raised to 50 cents for adults, double the original price. The price for children went up to 25 cents. Bathing suit and towel rental fees increased. Private swimming lessons were introduced at premium prices, catering to wealthier clientele. Private pool rentals for parties and events became available at rates that working-class families couldn't afford. The museum, which had always been free to browse for anyone who paid admission to the baths, started charging a separate entrance fee, 10 cents to view the collections without swimming. The democratic vision that Sutro had championed, the idea that the Sutro Baths belonged to everyone, was quietly abandoned in favor of profitability. But even with these changes, the Sutro Baths continued to lose money. The operating costs were simply too high. The facility was too large, too complex, too expensive to maintain. 2 million today, 8 million today, 5 million today, adjusted for the deflation that occurred after World War I. The estate tried everything. They hosted swimming competitions, bringing in professional swimmers and water polo teams, hoping to draw crowds and generate publicity. They rented the space for private events, weddings, corporate gatherings, charity galas, political rallies. They added an ice skating rink in 1936, converting one of the largest pools during the winter months by covering it with a wooden platform and installing refrigeration equipment. Ice skating was more popular than swimming in winter, they reasoned, and it would help offset the seasonal decline in attendance. They held dance competitions, roller skating events, vaudeville shows, anything to bring people through the doors and generate revenue. But nothing worked. The fundamental problem remained. The Sutro Baths were too big, too expensive, too isolated, and too impractical to ever be profitable. The business model had never made sense. Sutro had built it as a monument, not as a business. And monuments, no matter how grand, don't generate positive cash flow. And yet, they stayed open. For decades, they stayed open, bleeding money year after year, decaying slowly, becoming less a destination and more a relic of a bygone era. By the 1930s, the glass roof was cracked and leaking in dozens of places, Buckets were placed strategically around the pool deck to catch drips. By the 1940s, the pools were dingy, the tiles were cracked, the paint was peeling from the walls, and the museum had been largely dismantled and sold off piece by piece to cover debts. The taxidermied animals went first, sold at auction to private collectors, natural history museums, and wealthy eccentrics who wanted a stuffed lion in their parlor. The Egyptian mummies were sold to universities and museums that could afford them. The rare books and manuscripts went to libraries and private collectors. The medieval armor was auctioned off piece by piece. The Native American artifacts were scattered to the winds, sold to whoever would buy them, with little thought given to their cultural significance or proper preservation. The samurai armor went to a collector in Los Angeles. The fossils and minerals were sold to rock shops. Everything that made the Sutro Baths special, everything that gave it cultural value beyond just being a place to swim, was stripped away piece by piece, like scavengers picking at a carcass. By 1950, the museum was gone entirely. The corridors that had once displayed Sutro's collections were empty, the walls scarred with the outlines of removed display cases. All that remained was the bones of the building and the memory of what it had once been, but people still came. Not in the numbers they had in 1896, but they came. Working-class families from the Sunset District and Richmond District, neighborhoods that had finally developed during the 1930s and 1940s. Teenagers looking for a place to hang out away from their parents, swimming and flirting and testing the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Elderly men who remembered swimming there as children and came back out of nostalgia, even though the water was colder now, the tiles more cracked, the whole place suffused with an air of melancholy and decline. If that bothers you, if the idea of something beautiful being slowly stripped and degraded, if the idea of a dream dying by inches rather than all at once, if that makes you pause, then that pause matters. Because these are the moments where we're supposed to learn something, where history is supposed to teach us about the cost of unchecked ambition and the danger of building monuments to ourselves. And if you're still here, if you're still watching because you want to understand not just what happened, but why it matters, then maybe you're exactly the kind of person this channel is for. During World War II, the Sutro Baths experienced a brief, unexpected resurgence. With gas rationing limiting long-distance travel, San Franciscans looked for entertainment closer to home. The baths became a popular destination for soldiers on leave from the nearby Presidio military base, for families looking for affordable recreation during the austerity of wartime, for people trying to forget the war for a few hours and pretend that life was normal. Attendance spiked, revenue increased. For a brief moment, it looked like the Sutro Baths might finally become sustainable. But the moment the war ended, attendance plummeted again. People had cars now, or at least access to cars. They had money saved from wartime employment. They wanted new experiences, modern amenities, clean facilities. They wanted Disneyland, which opened in 1955 and immediately redefined what Americans expected from entertainment. They wanted suburban swimming pools, which were being installed in backyards across California as part of the post-war housing boom. They didn't want a crumbling Victorian bathhouse that smelled of mildew and disappointment, no matter how grand it had been 60 years earlier. By the 1950s, the Sutro estate was desperate. They tried to sell the property multiple times, but no one wanted it. The building was too large to convert into anything useful. Tearing it down would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, money the estate didn't have. And the location, while dramatic and scenic, was far from the city center and difficult to develop. The cliffs were unstable, the soil was sandy. Building anything substantial would require expensive foundation work. The Sutro Baths had become what economists call a stranded asset, something that had value once but no longer fits the world it exists in, too expensive to maintain and too expensive to remove. In 1952, the estate finally found a buyer. George Whitney, a wealthy entrepreneur who owned Playland at the Beach, a popular amusement park located just a few blocks south of the Sutro Baths. Whitney paid $250,000 for the property, a fraction of what Adolph Sutro had spent building it, but more than anyone else was willing to pay. Whitney had big plans. He wanted to convert the building into a combination ice skating rink and arcade, to integrate it with playland and create a massive entertainment complex that would draw visitors from across the Bay Area. He envisioned a modernized facility, stripped of the Victorian clutter, updated with neon lights and modern amenities. But George Whitney was 72 years old when he bought the Sutro Baths, and he was tired. He had spent decades running Playland, dealing with city regulations, fighting off developers who wanted to tear down his amusement park and build apartments, battling the changing tastes of a public that increasingly preferred television and air-conditioned movie theaters to outdoor entertainment. And within a few years, it became clear that even his deep pockets weren't deep enough to save the Sutro Baths. The operating costs remained crushingly high. The repairs were endless. Every time they fixed one problem, two more appeared. And the public, frankly, didn't care anymore. Swimming pools were common now, ubiquitous even. Every neighborhood had a public pool. Many families had private pools in their backyards. The novelty of the Sutro Baths had completely evaporated, and without novelty, there was no reason to make the long trip to the edge of the city. In 1964, George Whitney gave up. He was 84 years old, exhausted, and out of options. He announced that the Sutro Baths would be closed permanently and demolished to make way for high-rise apartments. The pools would be drained, the glass would be removed, the iron framework would be cut apart and sold for scrap, the entire structure would be torn down, the rubble hauled away, and the land graded flat for new construction. Modern apartments with ocean views, he said, apartments that would generate steady rental income and finally make the property profitable after 70 years of losses. And that should have been the end of the story. The Sutro Baths should have been quietly dismantled over the course of a year or two, the land sold to developers, the memory fading into obscurity along with 1,000 other grand projects that failed to outlive their creators. But on June 26, 1966, something happened that changed everything, something that ensured the Sutro Baths would be remembered not for what they were, but for how they ended. The fire started just after midnight on Sunday, June 26, 1906. No one knows exactly how, but there were whispers, whispers that grew louder over the years, whispers that suggested the fire was no accident. Consider the circumstances. The Sutro Baths had been closed for over a year. The building was largely empty, stripped of anything valuable. The insurance policy was still active. George Whitney had maintained coverage specifically because the building was scheduled for demolition, and he needed protection against liability during the dismantling process. The demolition itself was expensive. Estimates ranged from $200,000 to $500,000, depending on how carefully the work was done and how much material could be salvaged. But if the building burned down, the insurance company would pay, and the rubble would be much cheaper to clear than a standing structure would be to dismantle. And the fire started in multiple locations simultaneously. The fire department report noted that witnesses saw flames in at least 3 different sections of the building at roughly the same time: the eastern pool area, the western galleries, and the central promenade. Accidental fires typically start in one location and spread. Fires that start in multiple locations simultaneously are characteristic of arson. There's no proof, no charges were ever filed, no investigation concluded that George Whitney or anyone else deliberately set the fire, but the whispers never went away, and whether the fire was an accident, arson for profit, or simply the universe's way of putting the Sutro Baths out of their misery, the result was the same. By the time firefighters arrived at 1:47 a.m., the blaze was already out of control. The glass roof, weakened by decades of neglect and cracked in hundreds of places, shattered in the heat. Thousands of glass shards rained down onto the empty pools below, creating a sound like a windstorm made of crystal. The wooden beams that supported the structure, old-growth redwood that had stood for 70 years, ignited like kindling, flames leaping 30 feet into the air. The fire burned so hot that the iron framework began to twist and buckle, the metal glowing red, then white, before finally collapsing inward with a sound like a dying giant, a groan of tortured metal that echoed across the cliffs and out over the ocean. The fire department called in reinforcements. Engines from across the city responded, but there was almost nothing they could do. The building was massive. The fire had too much of a head start, and water was scarce. The facility's own water pumps had been disconnected, and the nearest fire hydrants were blocks away. Firefighters focused on preventing the fire from spreading to nearby structures, including the Cliff House restaurant and the few residential buildings in the area. They let the Sutro Baths burn. It took less than 6 hours for the Sutro Baths to be reduced to a smoking ruin. By dawn, the glass roof was gone entirely. The iron framework had collapsed into twisted skeletal remains. The wooden structures had been consumed. The pools, empty for over a year, were filled with ash and debris and the charred remnants of everything Adolph Sutro had built. The heat had been so intense that some of the concrete foundations had cracked. The tiles that had once lined the pools were blackened and broken. The next morning, San Franciscans woke to the news. Some more mourned. They remembered swimming there as children, remembered the museum, remembered when the Sutro Baths had been new and magnificent and full of promise. But most people shrugged. The Sutro Baths had been dying for so long that their destruction felt almost inevitable, a mercy killing rather than a tragedy. The newspapers ran photos of the ruins, blackened walls, twisted metal, empty pools filled with ash and debris. The article was sympathetic but brief, as if the city had already moved on before the embers had even cooled. And underneath those photos, underneath the brief articles, there was always the same question: what now? 2 million, equivalent to roughly $11 million today. He announced once again that he would develop the land into luxury apartments with ocean views. Architectural drawings were produced, models were built, promotional materials were printed, but the development never happened. Environmental regulations had changed. The California Coastal Commission, established to protect the coastline from overdevelopment, had veto power over construction near the ocean. Community groups opposed the apartment plan, arguing that the site should remain open space. The engineering challenges were more severe than anticipated. The cliffs were unstable, the soil was sandy and prone to erosion, and the cost of building a stable foundation for high-rise apartments was prohibitive. And George Whitney was old, in his mid-80s now, and he no longer had the energy to fight the bureaucratic battles necessary to push the project forward. He sold the land to a developer named Robert Fraser, who promised to build the apartments. Fraser sold it to another developer. That developer sold it to another. Each one made the same promises. Each one ran into the same obstacles. And slowly, over the course of several years, it became clear that the land would never be developed, that the ruins of the Sutro Baths would remain exactly as they were, slowly being reclaimed by nature, slowly eroding back into the landscape. In 1973, the National Park Service purchased the site as part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. The ruins were stabilized to prevent further collapse. Pathways were created for visitors. Interpretive signs were installed explaining the history, and the Sutro Baths, or what remained of them, were preserved as a historic site, not because they were particularly important to American history, but because they were there, because they were dramatic, and because the Park Service didn't know what else to do with them. Before we reach the end, ask yourself this: what are you building that you believe will last? What monuments, literal or metaphorical, are you constructing on the assumption that the world will care as much as you do? What invisible costs are you ignoring? What labor are you taking for granted? What contradictions are you refusing to see because the dream looks too beautiful to question? These are uncomfortable questions, but they're the questions that matter. And if you're still here, if this story has taken you somewhere unexpected, somewhere that makes you think differently about ambition and legacy and the price of both, then maybe that's enough. Maybe that's the reason we do this. Today, the ruins of the Sutro Baths are one of the most photographed locations in San Francisco. You can visit them any day of the year. You can park in the lot near the Cliff House and walk down a paved path that winds down the cliffside, switchbacking through ice plant and coastal scrub until you reach the ruins themselves. You can walk among the crumbling foundations and empty pools, now filled with seawater that flows in and out with the tide. You can see kelp growing in the pools, turning the water a dark greenish brown. You can see sea anemones and starfish clinging to the concrete where swimmers once stood. You can watch seals occasionally swim into the ruins from the ocean, curious about these strange geometric shapes that have no natural equivalent. The ruins are strangely beautiful, haunting in a way that no intact building could ever be. On foggy mornings, when the mist rolls in thick and the sound of waves echoes through the empty pools, when the visibility drops to 20 feet and you're surrounded by crumbling concrete and twisted metal that emerges from and disappears into the gray, it feels like standing inside a ghost story. It feels like the boundary between past and present has dissolved, like you could turn a corner and see the Sutro Baths as they were in 1896, full of swimmers and light and the impossible optimism of men who believed they could build paradise at the edge of the world. Tourists come to take photos. The ruins are Instagram famous now, tagged in thousands of posts by visitors from around the world who come specifically to photograph the apocalyptic aesthetic of these crumbling pools. Locals come to jog or walk their dogs, treating the ruins as just another part of the landscape, unremarkable in their familiarity. And occasionally, if you're lucky, you'll meet someone old enough to remember swimming there as a child, someone in their 70s or 80s now, and they'll tell you stories. They'll tell you about the slides, how terrifying they were, how fast you went, how your stomach dropped as you shot down the polished wood and hit the water so hard it knocked the breath out of you. They'll tell you about the icy pool, how their father made them swim in it because he believed cold water built character. They'll tell you about the museum, how crowded and strange it was, how the mummies gave them nightmares. They'll tell you about the smell, chlorine and salt water and mildew all mixed together, a smell so distinctive that catching a whiff of it today, 60 years later, immediately transports them back. And their voices always carry a note of loss, as if they're mourning not just the building, but a version of the city and of themselves that no longer exists. But what the tourists don't see, what the joggers don't think about, what even the old-timers who remember swimming there don't fully grasp, is the invisible history that still clings to these ruins like fog. The workers who died building the Sutro Tunnel in Nevada, their names forgotten, their deaths recorded only as statistics in reports that no one reads anymore. The construction crews who built the Sutro Baths, working in dangerous conditions for wages that barely fed their families. The maintenance workers who spent decades keeping the facility running, breathing chlorine fumes and coal smoke, earning modest wages while Sutro's name was celebrated in newspapers and his statue was erected in the park above. The Chinese laborers who were paid less than their white counterparts and whose injuries and deaths were rarely recorded. The janitors who cleaned the pools at night, scrubbing tiles on their hands and knees while the wealthy swam during the day. The boiler operators who worked in stifling heat, shoveling coal into furnaces for hours at a stretch. The lifeguards who saved drowning swimmers and received no recognition. The ticket sellers and towel attendants and food vendors, all of them working to keep Sutro's dream alive, while he received all the credit and they received barely enough to survive. History remembers Adolph Sutro as a visionary, a self-made millionaire who built something grand and gave it to the people. But history has a tendency to smooth over the rough edges, to ignore the costs that can't be measured in dollars, to forget the people who did the actual work while the man who paid for it gets immortalized. The human cost of the Sutro Baths didn't begin and end with construction. It continued every day the facility was open. Every ton of coal that was mined and shipped and burned was mined by workers in conditions that were brutal and dangerous. Every piece of glass that was manufactured and installed was made by workers who breathed toxic fumes and risked injury from molten glass. Every repair that was made, every pipe that was replaced, every broken tile that was fixed, all of it was done by human hands, by people whose names we don't know. people who have been completely erased from the historical record. This is the pattern of wealth in the Gilded Age, and it's a pattern that persists today. The people who build the monuments are forgotten, while the people who paid for them are immortalized. The people who do the work remain invisible, while the people who own the capital get their names carved in stone. And that should make us angry. It should make us question every statue, every named building, every monument to individual genius. Because genius doesn't build anything by itself. Vision doesn't pour concrete. Ambition doesn't install glass. All of that requires labor, and labor deserves to be remembered just as much as capital does. But there's another cost we need to talk about before this story ends, a cost that's harder to quantify but no less real. It's the cost of the dream itself, the cost of believing that wealth, properly applied, can create something pure and good and lasting, the cost of building a monument to your own vision and then watching it slowly crumble because the world doesn't care as much as you do. Adolph Sutro genuinely believed he was building something for the people. He believed that the Sutro Baths would democratize leisure, that they would give working-class families access to the kind of luxury that had previously been reserved for the wealthy elite. He believed he was creating a space where the immigrant laborer and the railroad baron could swim in the same pool, where children from Chinatown and children from Nob Hill could play together, where class distinctions would temporarily dissolve in the great equalizing medium of water. And in a way, he was right. For a few years, the baths were genuinely popular, genuinely accessible, genuinely enjoyed by thousands of people who couldn't afford to travel to expensive resorts or join exclusive clubs. For a brief moment, the Sutro Baths delivered on their promise, but Sutro's vision was built on a foundation of contradictions that he either couldn't see or refused to acknowledge. He wanted to create something democratic, but he controlled it entirely. Every decision was his. Every policy reflected his preferences. He wanted to keep prices low to ensure accessibility, but he also wanted the facility to be financially sustainable, and those two goals were fundamentally incompatible given the operating cost. He wanted the Sutro Baths to belong to the people, but he made absolutely certain that everyone knew they were his creation, his gift, his legacy. His name was everywhere, carved above the entrance, printed on tickets, mentioned in every newspaper article. And when the financial realities became impossible to ignore, when the operating costs outpaced revenue year after year, when his estate inherited the problem and had to make hard decisions, the democratic vision was abandoned immediately. Prices were raised. Policies were changed to favor wealthier customers. The museum charged extra fees. The facility shifted from being a public good to being just another business struggling to survive. This is the tragedy of the Sutro Baths. It was never really for the people. It was for Adolph Sutro. It was a monument to his ambition, his ego, his need to be remembered, his desire to be seen as a benefactor rather than just another robber baron who made his fortune exploiting labor. The fact that it also happened to benefit some working-class families for a few years doesn't change the fundamental truth that the entire project was built on the unstable foundation of one man's vanity. And vanity, no matter how well-intentioned, no matter how beautifully packaged, is a poor substitute for genuine sustainability, for genuine democratic ownership, for genuinely putting the needs of the community ahead of personal legacy. So what are we left with? What's the lesson here, if there is one? The ruins of the Sutro Baths sit at the edge of San Francisco, slowly being reclaimed by the ocean that Adolph Sutro thought he could harness. The pools fill in empty with the tide, twice a day, every day, just as they have for the past 60 years. The concrete cracks a little more with every winter storm. The iron rusts, flaking away in reddish-brown scales that stain the rocks below. The kelp grows thicker every year, transforming the pools from architectural ruins into something that increasingly resembles natural tide pools. And the tourists come, thousands of them every year, to take their photos and post them online and leave, most of them never knowing the full story of what they're looking at, most of them seeing only ruins and not understanding what those ruins represent. Adolph Sutro wanted desperately to be remembered, And he is. His name persists. Their Sutro Tower, the massive radio antenna that dominates the San Francisco skyline. There's Sutro Heights Park, the public park created from his clifftop estate. There are streets named after him, plaques commemorating him, historical societies dedicated to preserving his legacy. By the metrics he cared about, he succeeded. But what he's remembered for is not what he hoped. He's not remembered as the great Democrat who gave the people a palace to swim in, who broke down class barriers and created a space for genuine equality. He's remembered as the man who built something too big, too expensive, too impractical to survive. He's remembered as a cautionary tale about the limits of wealth and the danger of confusing vision with wisdom, about the difference between building something for your ego and building something the world actually needs. The Sutro Baths were a dream made real, but dreams, once made real, are subject to the same forces that destroy everything else: time, weather, economics, entropy, and the simple fact that the world moves on. The city didn't grow westward the way Sutro hoped. The working class didn't flock to his pools the way he imagined. The operating costs never declined. The revenue never increased enough. And the fortune he spent building paradise was ultimately wasted on a monument that no one asked for and no one could afford to keep standing. If you're still here, if this story has held you for this long, then you're here for more than spectacle. You're here because something about this story connects to something deeper: questions about what we build, why we build it, who it's really for, and what happens when our grandest visions collide with reality and reality wins. If those questions matter to you, if you think about them long after the screen goes dark, then maybe you understand what we're trying to do here. And maybe you'll be here when we tell the next story. The fog is rolling in again. It always does. At the edge of the ocean, it wraps around the ruins of the Sutro Baths like a shroud, blurring the boundaries between past and present, between what was and what remains. And if you stand there long enough, if you close your eyes and listen past the sound of the waves and the distant barking of sea lions on the rocks, you can almost hear it: the laughter of children who swam there a century ago, the shouts of young men showing off on the diving platforms, the conversations of families splashing in the shallow pools, the voice of a tour guide explaining the museum exhibits to wide-eyed school children, and underneath it all, quieter but no less present, the voice of a man who believed he could own the ocean itself, who believed his wealth could build something eternal, who died still believing that the world would eventually understand what he had tried to create. You can't, of course, own the ocean, build paradise, make anything last forever. Stop time, prevent entropy, ensure that your vision survives contact with reality, but you can try. And the ruins are proof that trying by itself is never enough, that good intentions don't guarantee good outcomes, that wealth can build monuments but can't make them meaningful, that legacy is something granted by history, not claimed by ego. The sun is setting now. The fog is getting thicker. The tourists are leaving, heading back to their hotels and vacation rentals, already thinking about dinner, already planning tomorrow's itinerary, already forgetting what they saw. The joggers have finished their routes. The dog walkers are heading home. And the ruins sit empty once again, waiting for the tide to come in, waiting for the ocean to fill the pools one more time, waiting for morning when the whole cycle will repeat. And somewhere, if you believe in such things, Adolph Sutro is watching, and he's finally beginning to understand what the rest of us knew all along: that monuments to ourselves are the most fragile things we can build, that the only legacy worth having is the one that makes other people's lives genuinely better, not the one that just has our name on it, that the truest measure of a life is not what you build, but what you leave behind in the hearts and minds of the people who come after. The Sutro Baths are gone. The man who built them is gone. But the questions they raise remain. Questions about wealth and power, and who gets remembered and who gets forgotten. Questions about the price of ambition and the cost of legacy. Questions about what we're building right now, today, in our own lives, and whether any of it will matter 100 years from now. If you're still here, if those questions haunt you the way they haunt us, then maybe that's enough reason to stay, to keep exploring these stories, to keep asking uncomfortable questions, to keep remembering the people who history forgot. Because if we don't remember them, no one will. And that would be the greatest tragedy of all.